How are we doing? You finding it yet?
Not quite yet, but I'm sure it will be up in just a second.
Hello, everybody. If you're finding us and watching live or after the fact, we are just getting things going here for Binge the Bible Breakdown, where we're going to be diving into the Gospels shortly.
We are live. You're on your phone.
What's that?
I said we are live.
You see me look at my phone
Yep.
to see if we're live. That's perfect.
Your thumb is working.
Okay. We are. Well, welcome everybody to Binge the Bible Breakdown. This is episode 5, where we're talking about the Gospels, and so we're going to be diving into that shortly. But first, we just want to welcome you here and say hello. I'm Pastor Nathan, pastor here at Elk River Lutheran.
And Jeremy Holquist, intern pastor. Welcome.
Yeah, as we said, welcome. We are going to be diving into the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then we're also going to include the book of Acts in there here today. And so that's our topic for today, is the Gospels, where with the prophets there's a whole bunch of them. With the Gospels there's only 4, so we even added an extra one, the Gospel, not the Gospel, but the book of Acts. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here today. So we're going to dive into these different books of the Bible here shortly. But first, we thought we'd start with just a little question, which is, what is your favorite gospel? So if you have a favorite gospel or something that you love about a particular gospel, would love to have you share that as we gather here. Even if you're watching after the fact or listening, go ahead and let us know in the comments. That'd be great. So how about you? You have a favorite gospel?
I do. I probably fall on the weird side, but John is mine.
Okay.
So I love John's use of light and dark, and
Sure.
this idea of logos, word, speaking to previous creation to kind of this continued creation. So I actually find myself in John most often.
Sure.
How about you?
Yeah, I think I really do like John quite a bit also, in that it's kind of different, but there are things I certainly love more about the other ones. I like the kind of the cosmic grand scale of the Gospel of John, the way it talks about the world and life and faith. But then I think I really like the storytelling more in some of the other ones. You know, like
Sure.
Mark has a real speed to it. It goes fast, and I like that. And I like the teachings in Matthew. You know, the Sermon on the Mount. It's hard to beat those. It's a whole long string of teachings. And yeah, that's a lot of the things we'll get to here today. Are these different elements that are so good. So
I think
it's hard to pick just one.
It is. And when you're kind of a nerd, it's even worse.
Yep.
But I love that all 4 of them kind of paint this unique picture of who Jesus is from these kind of varied lenses and experiences.
Yeah.
And all sort of wrap perspective around the personhood of Jesus. It's fun to what was Jesus like? What was his ministry? How did he interact with people? Or these big questions that lay kind of under the surface of these texts.
Yeah. So we're going to kind of work through each of these books of the Bible for this morning, but then we're also going to start by just a more pulled out view. So I'll throw up the image of these books that we're talking about, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're into the New Testament now, so that, after that 400 years of silence that we talked about last week, if you want to go back and hear that, where there's a chunk of time where there aren't books of the Bible being written, and that time of history not really being told, we get to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. That's the order that they come in, but not necessarily the order that they were written in, and we'll get to that, right? And so one of the most interesting parts, I think, of biblical history, like one of my favorite parts of biblical criticism and the ways that scholars have understood the Bible, is this idea of where the different books of the Bible, the different Gospels, come from. And some of you have probably noticed before that the Gospels have some things in common, and yet they're all different, right? They all tell the story of the life and ministry of Jesus, his birth and death and resurrection. Well, not always birth, not always resurrection, actually, but they tell this story, but all in different ways. Some parts are really similar, some parts are really different. And so I remember always kind of wondering, why is that? And fortunately, we have these biblical scholars who've kind of put names and theories behind it. And so I brought one resource here, the diagram diagram of synoptic relationships. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered the synoptic gospels. And synoptic, the word synonym, it's because they're very similar. There's parts of them that are just word for word verbatim. There's parts that are just really close. At least the ideas are the same. And people have noticed this for a long time. So I found this really old resource. Oh man, this is going to be good. At an old theological library that was going out of business, I guess. And what what this has is it breaks down. It's Matthew on both ends, Mark in the middle, and Luke here. And all of these color codings and the lines are drawing connections between, like, which of these books of the Bible are connected, like which are the exact same, where are all those connections drawn. And so anyway, this kind of work was being done, and what biblical scholars came up with is something called the two-source hypothesis for the Synoptic Gospels. We can just lay this down. We'll fold it up later. And to explain this, I actually created my own graphics. So, believe it or not, I made this little graphic. Here's the completed version.
Are we high-tech or low-tech in this?
Oh, we are Sharpie on a white piece of paper. So, it is pretty good stuff, though. And so what you'll see here, so the idea is, most folks agree that Mark was probably written first. And so you have the Gospel of Mark being written first, and what we see in Matthew and Luke is that they take some stories and teachings just verbatim. So you have Mark, and some of those same things appear in Matthew and Luke. But when scholars started looking at all those connections, they also noticed connections between Matthew and Luke that were word for word in Matthew and Luke, but were not there in Mark. And so they started to think, like, where did these come from? And the way they were written and such, it seemed like that they weren't coming, that Matthew wasn't just writing them and then Luke copying them, that they were coming together unique because they only took some of the stories and not each other, because all these biblical writers were borrowing from each other. And so scholars came up with this idea that there must have been a different source, another source that they named Q. An unfortunate name in today's American context. Q is not great. But this is not a conspiracy theory based on the internet. This is a biblical theory of, Q stands for Quella, is the German word. It just means source, because they knew that there's this other source. And so that's how they labeled these additional stories that show up in Matthew and Luke, but aren't in Mark. And so they get those sources that we see that there's these things in common. And then finally, we get to the Gospel of John, who's just on his own island over there. He didn't take anything from Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or Q. He just kind of does his whole own thing, right, and tells the story in its own way. And I think it's helpful to kind of think about this. Here's the low-tech version that I drew and photographed for this. But I think it's a helpful way of understanding how these Gospels are put together. Partially because it's like, oh, that's why some things are similar and some things are different. But it also gets at the fact that these Gospels, none of them were really written to be the be-all and end-all telling of the life of Jesus. The tradition at the time was an oral tradition, and so finally a handful of gospel writers just got around to writing it down. These stories that had been floating around for decades by that point, and telling the life of Jesus, and they wrote them down, each to their own particular audience, each to with their own specialties in mind, like their own gifts and creativity, that the story that they wanted to tell about Jesus, and they tried to, like any author does, tell a story that makes sense and has a flow to it and stuff. And so anyway, so that's where we get these kind of different gospel accounts, and that's, I think, where we're going to go, is diving into, okay, what is similar in each of these, what is different, what's unique to each of these books of the Bible.
Yeah. Nailed it.
Yeah. Anything else with that, with kind of the sourcing or things?
No, I think one thing to kind of think about is so we get the sourcing that you explained, which is awesome, mm-hmm. but then we get what happens when it's put into the canon. So when it's put into this kind of segment of all the books combined into one, mm-hmm. there's some thinking and ordering that happens within that, is which tells the story picking up from Malachi into the story of this 400 years of silence, and that's Matthew's gospel, because Matthew really writes from a Jewish lens.
Yep.
And so there's some of these kind of things that are happening, so they look funny, they're out of order, it'll feel like, okay, we're going to kind of go through them a little bit differently to try to help make meaning and sense of that.
Yeah.
But that's one of the kind of key things that happens as we get to the canon and it's put together. So there's a little bit of adjustment that happens.
Yeah. Because it's like, I think this is a basic thing to help kind of understand why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar and John is so different, and yet also why they are all similar and different just between those three similar ones too. And so,
and John's was written significantly later than the other three Gospels, so it's used this kind of different style of rhetoric. And the way he approaches is using this circling back theory. So if you believe this is true, then this is also true, and it kind of moves us through. And you'll hear that in Romans too as we get to that one. Yeah.
Well, shall we dive into these Gospels?
We should dive in. Do you want to start with the Mark as the first one? Or should we start with Matthew because it's the first in chronological order?
Let's go Mark. The order we have them in the notes here. And so, because I put the graphic here in order that they appear in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But like you're saying, they put Matthew there when they put it together to help bridge the gap from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
Right.
But I think it's helpful to kind of think chronologically, since that's what we were just talking about too. So we're going to start with Mark.
Right. And so Mark begins with this kind of message of euangelion. You learned Greek today. And I'm probably butchering it because my Greek was long ago. But this idea that good news, there's a story to be told. And so Mark is really kind of in this approach right out of the gate saying the good news of Jesus Christ. It's a message that we get to kind of wrap our heads around and really kind of dive into. And he moves us into this idea of this kingdom here on earth and a kingdom of heaven, and really playing with this language that we are a little bit more familiar with now. But people at the time, this would have been absolutely their language. And so the anointing of a king that happens with King David and King Saul, that God anoints them and moves into the story. And Jesus steps right into that story. And it's this idea that the promise of God is fulfilled in the personhood of Jesus. And so we get kind of these interesting connections back to our Old Testament that carry forward. And really the audience he's speaking to are people of Jewish descent and Jewish ancestry. And so there would have been a lot of familiar parallels in language. And so it was important to connect Jesus, the person, to this promise of God. And so continuing to see that thread throughout that.
I think the other thing I think of with the Gospel of Mark, it's the shortest. We believe it's the earliest written, but it's also the shortest. And one of the things when you read the Gospel of Mark, and it is the one, like if you want to pick up and read a whole Gospel, Mark's the easiest, it's the shortest, and it moves fast. Like, not just because it's the shortest you can read it the fastest, but if you pay attention, like the word immediately shows up all the time. Jesus is always on the move, and the way it's structured as a whole, there's kind of the book right in the middle, like chapter 8, where it turns, where it's like this life and ministry of Jesus, and then in chapter 8 everything turns and heads towards Jerusalem and the cross. And so there's just some real movement that just really keeps things going in the Gospel of Mark.
Often it's reading Mark is like drinking from a fire hose. It's just this idea of stories end abruptly and we move on to the next thing because it was a sense of urgency.
Now this, now this, now this, now this.
And Mark is writing with a lens of this idea in Malachi, and these prophets were really saying the coming king will come quickly, and so we need to be kind of aware and on the move for that. And this is where this kind of Mark's immediacy really parallels and lives into that story. What's interesting, Jesus isn't born in Mark's gospel, but baptized. And so that's one note kind of worth lifting out too.
Mark doesn't have a Christmas story. It starts with John the Baptist and his appearing as an adult.
And so this idea that Jesus is anointed in through baptism, brought into the story as a king, and then we see this disruption of kingdom leaders, and Jesus kind of butting heads with the elite or the top of the mold here.
Yeah.
So this kind of interesting story of Jesus coming up against these powers that be.
Yeah.
And so which kingdom is established through Jesus?
Yeah.
Either the kingdom of the world or the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, another kind of interesting literary device that the Gospel of Mark uses, and literary device, I mean, I feel like I'm taking an English class, but I think it is helpful to remember that these were authors who were translating essentially these oral traditions and writing them in a way to make the story interesting. So I think there is some intentionality in the way it's written, that he uses the word immediately a lot. He ends stories abruptly and keeps it moving. Another literary device in the Gospel of Mark is what people have sometimes called the Messianic secret. And basically what that is you'll notice throughout the Gospel of Mark, and this happens in some other places, but especially in Mark, he's always telling people, don't tell anyone. Like, I am the Son of God, I am, like these big predictions, and then don't tell anyone. And so there's this notion that this is a big secret. And of course the irony is we're reading it, so we're in on the secret. And that's why we call it a literary device. It's intentional that as you read the Gospel of Mark, there's this secrecy to who Jesus is that's not revealed till the end, except for you, the reader, who know the secret the whole way along. It's nice to be on the inside.
Right. Yeah, and in this idea that outsiders don't exist. There's this kind of wrestling internally there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think another place to lift up is this idea that kingdom. We talk about it, that Old Testament. What do we see often with kingdoms is destruction and ruin. We're hearing this kind of prophetic voice against this, and Jesus comes into the picture, and the kingdom of God is actually brought into the world by healing.
Sure.
And so by restoration, by renewal, and all of these kind of layers of what the world has done is completely turned on its head with Jesus. And we kind of begin to unpack that idea of God continuing to work. And it shows up then again in the idea of the suffering servant, that Jesus comes in as someone who will bear the pain of the world in order that the world might see that sense of healing.
Yeah.
And we begin to kind of have to wrestle with this question, well, what is Jesus' purpose?
Yeah.
And it is one of those interesting things in Mark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other pieces you want to really highlight from Mark, you think?
I think this idea, the Last Supper is a good one in Mark. The idea that the meal is betrayal.
Yeah.
There's this notion of what that would be. And Jesus responds by reasserting this intent for how the world would be seen, and how Jesus would be counter the world. And so rather than betrayal, it would be a sense of cleaning, making whole. And thinking about that as this notion in Mark's gospel of who people need to experience, and who Jesus calls them to live into moving forward.
Right.
So it's a good thing to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, so then of course we get crucifixion, and that's the whole kind of passion narrative is almost half of the Gospel of Mark, where they like I said, at chapter 8 it kind of turns and starts heading towards Jerusalem, and then from then on out everything is focused towards the cross, and ultimately then of course Jesus is crucified and dies, but the resurrection is a little dicey in Mark. Like in the other Gospels we get nicer, more full resurrection accounts. If you read in your Bible, chances are any Bible you have, not just a study Bible, but there will be notes at the end of the Gospel of Mark that basically add a little more. And it'll say like original accounts didn't include this last bit, which is the resurrection, which is just going to the temple, or going to the tomb rather, and seeing that it's empty and running away in fear. The end, not like, wow, he is risen indeed. There's no appearances of the risen Jesus, like saying, don't be afraid, I've been there's none of that. It's just, it ends in fear, and that's the good ending. The other ending is just Jesus dies, and right. So that's a different piece with the Gospel of Mark.
Right. Yeah, and the idea, the ripping of the curtain in the temple, Jesus is released, that God is released to the world. And that's part of Mark's illustration kind of point, is this personhood of Jesus coming in, being sort of brought forward into the rest of the story.
Yeah.
And so there's no needing to be made one way or another. There's no insider outsider, but that God is released to the whole of humanity.
Right.
Yep.
I like that.
It's a fun way to end.
Yeah.
Not really. But
Well, I like the so the temple, the curtain of the holy holies, which separated, like, this was the holy place that only the highest priest could go once a year and sprinkle a sacrifice and experience this presence of God, which was there in a more powerful way than anywhere else. At the crucifixion of Jesus, that's ripped and God is set loose. That's the good part. That Jesus died and just laid in the tomb and we don't know what happens next. That's not a great ending, but
right.
fortunately then the other gospel writers pick up, and that's in our minds. I think a lot of times we skip from like we always think at Christmas time, well, there's a Christmas story, even though Mark doesn't include that, and I think that's okay. And I think there's a reason the biblical, when they put the Bible together, they could have just taken all these accounts and smashed them together into one book and just called it Jesus, but they didn't. They left these books individually the way they were written, so that we could experience them as they were created.
Right.
I think that's good.
Yeah, and I think as we lean into Matthew kind of has this perspective of so what?
Yeah.
And I think Matthew's gospel being the first one comes out of this history of Malachi. Well, what does Jesus mean to us now? 400 years, that's several generations of families.
Yeah.
Well, that story gets twisted and lost and kind of confused. And so Matthew begins to sort of piece together, here's your history that you know.
Yeah.
But here's this person in Jesus who lives to fulfill that history.
Right.
And he's really kind of saying, so what do the people of God do now? I mean, what's our moving forward step?
Yeah.
And it's this great thing because of the focus on this Jewish lens, this Jewish storytelling, and really saying, God is for you as a people, even though there might have been times that didn't feel like it.
Yeah.
And so I think we're left with this interesting perspective. And it comes, Matthew's genealogy begins it, and then into this, the what do you call it, the crisis that happens, the virgin birth, and kind of moving into this narrative, and then kind of the first people to visit Jesus as a baby are foreigners. They're the outsiders. So it's not just your Jewish lens, but it's also who in the whole of creation can be here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting take.
It is, yeah. And so that's where in Matthew we get a more traditional Christmas story, not the Christmas story that we usually celebrate. We'll get to that more in Luke, but very much, it's the stable, it's the wise men coming from afar, the folks from the east and all that.
Yeah. And I think Matthew's gospel is this sort of resistance to evil, and it begins with Jesus' temptation. I think this idea that we as people are called to resist this force of evil that exists in the world, and Jesus butts heads with that, and that's the question for us. So what for us? What are we called to do? And some of that is living out this promise that God has kind of carried forward through history. Beatitudes. Do we talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, and the Sermon on the Mount as a whole, there's a whole section in the Gospel of Matthew that is teaching, and often attributed primarily to the Sermon on the Mount, where you get, some of the best known teachings, like the Beatitudes, like the parables about the lost things, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, all come out of that Matthew teaching section, and it's good stuff.
Right, and again, it's the world turned upside down. Everything. If you read the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit is just a really okay. What do we make of that? But this idea that the lowly become lifted through the presence of Jesus. How do we see that ministry carried forward and kind of lived into? And you can go through most of the Beatitudes are in that same vein of the opposite is true. Even though we still feel the suffering and the reality of life. And Matthew's gospel really wants us to sit in the existence of suffering in the world and to think about who is the path out of that, or how do we get out of that. Well, that's through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Matthew's account of the resurrection is probably the most intense. And so just thinking about the religious leaders push against Jesus, trying to get him put to death, and they keep pushing this issue. And Herod even washes his hands of the blood and says, I want nothing to do with this. And so Herod is kind of this interesting character in Matthew's gospel too.
Yeah. He's not the criminal so much.
Yeah, and again, the ground shakes in Matthew's gospel. I mean, he's got all these beautiful imagery of like what could be destruction is kind of fulfilled in this resurrection.
Yeah.
And so, and it ends with this kind of thought of that faith and doubt can live together. And this is that fear, thinking about this idea of they left but they had questions, or they left and they doubted. They left and they had fear, all parallel in the end of Matthew's gospel. And leave us kind of wondering.
Yeah. Well, and also the Great Commission, and that's where you get the notion that, okay, this is maybe coming a little later, where it's like there's a church and there's an organization, there's people going and telling others about Jesus, that Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, comes from Matthew. So that's good.
Yeah. Luke?
Yes. Luke.
Most notably a physician.
Yeah.
But also has some sort of historian based on how they interpret the text. So he speaks very well to the past and past history, and kind of leans into that lens of reflection too.
And seemingly almost commissioned to write this story. You see that, is it Theophilus? It's just, I don't know my notes. Yeah. Anyway, he has a patron, who is essentially, it seems, paying him likely to write this story down. And so Luke does in a two-part story, a two-part series, first the Gospel of Luke, and then the book of Acts also then is attributed to Luke, that goes into what the disciples do after Jesus has been crucified and risen, and then he ascends into heaven, and then they kind of get to starting the church, and ultimately then Paul gets into the story too. And so we'll get there. I guess I kind of summarize it now, but the Gospel of Luke, written, by Luke, and this is where we get the really good birth story, right? The really good Christmas story that Linus reads every Christmas in the Peanuts telling of the Charlie Brown Christmas. Linus reads from Luke chapter 2, and that's the Christmas story that is the most familiar. In those days, a decree went out from the Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. It's a very familiar flowing. That first, it's 1 through 20, and it's it's good. It's a beautiful Christmas story. That also, it starts in chapter 2 because chapter 1 is the the family tree, basically. Again, right? It's all the who begat who begat who begat who, who were all of Jesus's ancestors.
Right. In Luke's gospel, it's interesting to read who fits in there. There's a prostitute, there's Ruth. It's kind of got another layer of development because it's beyond sort of our understanding, simplified understanding of the story.
Yeah.
But that the people who are most notably in Luke's genealogy list are the people who would be considered lowly in nature.
Sure, yeah.
And then they're elevated in these stories. And so this is kind of Luke's kind of underlying theme. You're going to hear it in Luke's gospel a lot, that the lowly are brought higher, and the higher brought lowly. And so this sort of reversal of power and reversal of really role, I think is a good way to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so continuing, there's all these kind of great stories, the prodigal son, the sermon at Nazareth, the oppressed claim the year of the Lord's favor. I mean, I love that language of those that don't have much are still kind of rejoiced by God.
Right.
And again, prodigal son, the lost has been restored. These lost stories fall into this category too.
Right.
Yeah.
I said they were in Matthew. I said wrong.
Well, there's pieces in...
Bits and pieces of them are. Yep.
So, if you jump in your bulletin this week, inside the main kind of text for this are kind of blocks of things that are unique to each gospel.
Yep.
But in the reading are similar stories, so where you're going to find the same story in all three gospels, or all four gospels, technically.
Yeah.
look at that, it's a good way to kind of keep us on our toes too.
Yeah, keep us straight. Because that's a part of the challenge, is that they're all so similar and so different, and yet and share so much in common. So
right,
yeah,
and it is even like as we get to the death scene in Luke, Jesus' death is really this upside down world. He asks forgiveness for God's people, not for him.
Yeah.
Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This story of the two criminals, for surely you'll be with me in paradise. Like, these kind of bringing up of people within Luke's gospel.
Yeah.
And even this idea of resurrection, it's about us as God's people who are on this side.
Yeah.
Really thinking about what does that mean for us.
Yeah.
And then this road to Emmaus, we're kind of left with this interesting story. Jesus walks alongside, and they don't know him until it gets to this final moment. And really to think about how do we imagine Jesus' presence in the world, and this idea that suffering is a reality of life, but it is not the answer.
Right.
And so we kind of deal with all these big questions in Luke's gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. And that road to Emmaus is just one of the great resurrection kind of accounts. And good stuff.
Yeah.
Anything else on Luke?
No, we can go to John.
Yeah. John is the weirdo of the Gospels, right? I mean, it's the account that's the most different.
Right.
That all that, those synoptics, the three that are so similar, John shares very little with them. I mean, structurally and like word for word, kind of. Obviously, it still tells the same story of Jesus, where there is a Last Supper, only he washes feet instead of doing bread and wine,
Right.
and there is, teaching and healing, and there's all those elements. There's the crucifixion and resurrection, but it's just told differently. And I think one of the big differences comes right at the beginning, where we don't get a traditional Christmas story. And so I think it's so interesting that John would have been written into a context like kind of the last one written, where those Christmas stories already existed and had been told. And so that's where I think it's so interesting that John chooses not to just retell that Christmas story, but to kind of start with this like cosmic drama, like to put Jesus into this big, huge cosmic drama, where it's not just, the story of Jesus starts, way back, in 30 years ago when Mary got pregnant, and
Right.
but rather going back to the beginning and using that language from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, in the beginning then was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word is with God. And it paints Jesus as this presence of God that didn't just become incarnate and manifest at the year zero, but
Right.
rather from the very beginning of creation, God, Christ, has been present in this created world. And that and so that's pretty big, and that's where you get the light imagery. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness doesn't overcome it. That's this big like painting of who Jesus is, who Christ is in the context of the world.
Right.
That's different.
Yeah, and it harkens some to the Job text too, in that
Sure.
were you there when I created the world? Will you be there when the world ends? Like, this idea that this is cosmic beyond just this sort of momentary experience that we have. God is in the beginning, God will be in the end.
Yeah.
And so we're left with this story kind of pieced in the middle. And so there are some kind of connections Old Testament that come into John's gospel as well. So yeah. It's this idea too, you said light and dark, that darkness is alienation. That to be in the darkness really means that you're just not with the rest of God's creation. And I think this imagery for John is really kind of telling about living into that light and presence. Is to witness and bear witness to what God has done in the world. And in doing so, we're interconnected to that story.
So much is relationship. So much is just grounded in our relationships, our relationship with God, but with each other, that we experience God with each other. And I think that's a big part of why Jesus' first miracle, you have in the notes here, is water turned to wine at a wedding reception.
Right.
It's this outpouring of God's abundance. That whole wedding in Cana story is this like really big miracle, but it's also it's abundance and it's relational. It's so that people can continue to be together and celebrate the joys of life.
Right. Yeah, and the sense of merriment that comes in this story is, I think, something that's wonderful. You didn't save the best for the beginning or last or whatever it is. I'm going to mess that story up, but this idea that it's jovial celebration that comes out of that, and it comes to in this idea. John's approach to the feeding of the 5,000 is the reality is people have enough to eat, yet daily life is this challenge and struggle. And when God steps into the picture, when our dependence is on God, that changes that conversation, and we're left with this abundance. And yet you still have to face the reality of life. And it's this idea that relationship is the priority. And John's gospel butts it up against religious leaders probably more than most, in the fact that almost everything that Jesus does really alienates people and saying, well, you can't heal on the Sabbath, you're doing all these actions and things that are just chaotic to this understanding of who Jesus is. And I think it's really kind of interesting to see that tension that happens in John's gospel again and again. That the counter-cultural nature of Jesus really turns the world on its head. Raising of Lazarus is another one of those kind of fun stories. Jesus really becomes a threat when he heals Lazarus, because then this is someone who's healing, who's bringing life, who's pushing up against what feels normal, and he does so again by offering life. I think that term comes up in John's a lot. And so
that is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back for the religious leaders in the grand narrative, is that if someone can raise people from the dead, of course, I mean, that challenges a lot of theological issues, but even just political and power of every kind. It's like that's the ultimate power. And
it speaks to capacity beyond what was normal or perceived or could be made up. I mean, this is something that Jesus steps into and against.
But it's also in the context of relationship, because it's also where Jesus weeps. You get that shortest verse of the Bible, Jesus wept, because he's sad that his friend Lazarus dies. And that's not to be missed in the whole thing too, is that even that is, he is friends with Lazarus, and Lazarus's sisters, Mary and Martha, are, they're all in relationship together. And so that's why it's such a tragedy, and why he, still raises him from the dead.
And it's also interesting too, John's gospel, Jesus mentions, or Jesus' mother is mentioned, that was hard to say, twice right at the beginning, and at the end as Jesus is taken in the cross and saying, this is your son, this is your mother. And this kind of interesting exchange. And it's this idea that John has to wrestle with, how do we make meaning of Jesus' death? Like, for the average person, death is this hard untruth, really. How do I live into those spaces? And John really takes this head on by saying, that relationship is beyond what we kind of wrestle with and understand as a person of Jesus. And so I think it is, giving oneself to another is this sort of living into this life. And it happens again and again. And so sour wine, good wine is his first miracle. Sour wine is what he receives at his death. And so thinking about these kind of parallels too in the story. And it ends with Mary entering the tomb. Jesus is gone. She frantically runs and tells everybody. And Jesus encounters her again. But there's this cool thing that happens is he names Mary. And Mary knows who he is. And so Craig Kester talked about it in terms of, he's a professor of mine from seminary, but he talked about that to be known, to know your name in John's gospel is to be given life. And I love that image of how that's lived out. It
is. And then we get lots of other good in the Gospel of John. many more resurrection appearances, including Thomas, poor doubting Thomas, and and these other the fishing and the campfire by the sea, and there's just some really great resurrection stories where where Jesus greets him and says this isn't the end.
Right.
And so I think our scripture reading for Sunday actually comes from the Gospel of John 2, where it's one of the commands which actually comes through the Gospels, this command to love one another that takes a little different language but is pretty common through all the Gospels, and to love one another. And it's also where Jesus says, I have called you friend. And so that relational element in John just really carries through, and it's pretty foundational.
So why would we include Acts in the gospel, Nathan?
Well, we got to put it somewhere. That's one part. That it's not a letter like the rest of the letters of Paul and the other apostles, and Revelation, which is kind of a weird letter, but. And of course, it's written by Luke, and so that's where we thought, this is kind of where it fits. The Gospel of Luke then kind of is meant to continue on into the book of Acts, and that's where it really picks up the story, where the disciples are kind of around and Jesus is showing up sometimes, and then there's the big ascension, and he ascends into heaven like we say in the Creed, and then those disciples are left to get to the business of creating what we know as the church now. And so it kind of tells the story of those early years of the church.
Awesome. Good job.
Yeah, that's why.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting too, we talk about Acts. The Pentecost comes up in Acts,
yep.
So Acts chapter 2.
Yep.
And we're left with this story of language. In the Tower of Babel story, the language is used as a thing to build themselves higher to God. Mm-hmm. In Acts, in the Pentecost story, language is used to become individual to communities, that they begin to speak other languages in order that the gospel is communicated to people as a whole.
Yeah.
And so everybody gets to hear this kind of common language, but in their own tongue. And so it's this, again, flipping the Old Testament narrative back on its head to this kind of personhood of Jesus.
Yeah.
And the work of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, it's this notion that all can hear in this kind of miracle of Pentecost the good news of Jesus in their own language, and it's foreshadowing to what will come for the rest of the time, which is the disciples and other early apostles will travel the world, spreading the good news of Jesus, and sometimes they won't travel far, and they'll hunker down in Jerusalem, but then then Paul arises, who travels all over the place and really ends up writing a whole bunch of letters to these different churches that he starts and meets along the way, and those become a big chunk of the Bible that we'll talk about next week.
Right. And I think the idea, Acts 4 talks about, now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. So this is the idyllic, whatever, however we say that, picture of the church as a whole. This early church is that people just shared what they had, and they lived together in a common purpose.
Yeah.
And then we spend the rest of Acts and moving forward into the letters figuring out how we messed that up again.
Yeah.
But this idea that people lived together, they operated together, they served together, that there's sort of this unity of the body of Christ. And the letters begin to kind of show us that all starts to fall apart.
Yeah. Well, and it does fall apart a little bit in Acts, too. You get all kinds of really good and interesting stories. They shared all things in common, but you get the story of a couple who tried to skim a little off the top and not share everything, but just share some, and they fall over dead. And so it's even more to the story than that, but that's the thumbnail version. But there are just really interesting stories. There's really great characters, there's miracles, and there's kind of odd things, there's kind of funny things. There's a kid who falls asleep during one of Paul's long sermons and falls out a window and dies from boredom from a sermon, basically, and Paul raises him from the dead, then goes back in and finishes his sermon. You
Right.
can't beat that. That's, as a preacher, I'm like, that's commitment.
Right.
You kill him with boredom, raise him from the dead, and keep on going. So it's just, there's a lot that happens, including Paul, like traveling around place to place, and that's where you get the stories of then Paul in prison and the walls coming down. There's just great stories, and
this idea of how healing begins to take root in the work of the disciples and into these communities, and this idea of unity that continues to kind of formulate these letters, and where we'll figure out these things going forward.
Yep,
it's just a common message meant for common people.
Yeah, and it's great to have those stories of Paul, I think, because as we get into the letters next week, the letters of Paul don't tell much about what he's doing or where he is or who he is even, and so it's helpful to have that background going in, and I think we'll touch on that in the, as we get into the letters, a little more about who Paul is, so I don't think we'll go into that too much here today. But Paul becomes kind of the guy for how we understand church and faith, and his letters really become the building blocks of theology, even in at least equal to the Gospels, if not more so, I would say, theologically.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else?
It's
the
a great place to
Gospels.
end.
Yeah. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts.
Yep.
Yeah.
Luke Acts. Yeah.
Luke Acts, yeah. Yeah, so we hope that you'll join us on Sunday. We're going to be, like I said, we'll touch on this stuff as an introduction to the preview in worship, and then a sermon will ask the question, what if God was one of us? That's a question from a Joan Osborne song in the 90s, a pop song, but gets to that question, okay, what do we do if God is one of us? What do we do with this incarnated Jesus who is a part of this world then and now? And so that'll be Sunday, and then next week, Thursday, we'll be wrapping her up. Last episode 6, the letters and Revelation. So we're covering a lot of books next week, and it'll be good. We'll get it. We'll get it, right?
If you're interested in Revelation, you'll have some fun with that one. It'll be a good one to tune in for.
Yeah, absolutely. So until then, thanks for tuning in here and spending some time with us, and we'll see you Sunday and next week. Take care, everybody.